There have been several remarkable cases throughout history of whale carcasses exploding, either naturally due to the buildup of gas during decomposition or intentionally through human intervention. These incidents have occurred in various parts of the world, from Canada to South Africa, Iceland to Australia, and the United Kingdom. However, one particular case stands out above all others, not just for its sheer absurdity, but for the way it captured the imagination of the public and refuses to fade from memory. The most widely reported case of an exploding whale occurred in Florence, Oregon, in November 1970. On November 9th, a massive 45-foot-long sperm whale washed ashore on the central Oregon coast. The creature, weighing approximately 8 short tons, presented a significant problem for local authorities. At the time, Oregon beaches fell under the jurisdiction of the state's Highway Division, and they were tasked with the unusual challenge of dealing with a rapidly decomposing whale carcass. After consulting with the United States Navy, Oregon officials made what would prove to be a controversial decision. They determined that the best approach was to remove the whale using dynamite, operating on the assumption that the resulting explosion would scatter the remains into pieces small enough for scavenger animals to consume. It was a plan that seemed logically sound on paper, but would soon go catastrophically wrong. George Thornton was the engineer placed in charge of this unusual operation. In later interviews, he admitted that he was not entirely certain how much dynamite would be needed for the job, later explaining that he had been selected for the task simply because his supervisor had gone hunting and was unavailable. A charge of 1/2 short ton of dynamite was ultimately selected for the blast. Complicating matters further, a military veteran with extensive explosives training happened to be in the area and witnessed the preparations. He immediately warned officials that the planned 20 cases of dynamite was far too much explosive power, estimating that just 20 sticks would have been more than sufficient to do the job. Unfortunately, his expert advice went unheeded, and the massive charge remained in place. The dynamite was detonated on November 12, 1970, at precisely 3:45 p.m. A cameraman named Doug Brazil was on hand to film the event for a story by news reporter Paul Linman of CATU TV in Portland, Oregon. What followed was captured forever in that now iconic news footage, a record of one of the most spectacular government failures ever to be broadcast on television. In his now famous voiceover, Linman jokingly observed that landlubber newsman became landblubber newsman for the blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds. The explosion, far from creating the small chunks officials had hoped for, launched massive pieces of whale flesh, weighing hundreds of pounds nearly a quarter-mile inland. The blast scattered debris across parking lots and near buildings situated some distance away from the beach itself. Only a small portion of the whale was actually disintegrated by the explosion. The majority of the carcass remained on the beach, forcing workers from the Oregon Highway Division to manually clear away what remained. In his report, Linman also noted that the scavenger birds, whom officials had hoped would consume the remaining remains after the explosion, never appeared, likely scared away by the tremendous noise of the blast. In an ironic twist of fate, just days before the blast, a local explosive expert had purchased a new automobile as part of a promotional event called Get a Whale of a Deal. That car would be damaged by a chunk of falling blubber, forever becoming part of the legend of the exploding whale. Ending his famous story, Linman prophetically noted that it might be concluded that should a whale ever be washed ashore in Lane County again, those in charge would not only remember what to do, but would certainly remember what not to do. When 41 sperm whales beached themselves nearby in 1979, state parks officials took a considerably more cautious approach, choosing to burn and bury the carcasses rather than risk another explosive situation. Later that same day, Thornton spoke with the Eugene Register-Guard newspaper. stating that the operation had gone just exactly right, except that the blast had funneled a hole in the sand under the whale. He also acknowledged that several chunks of whale had been blown back toward the onlookers and their vehicles. Thornton was subsequently promoted to the Medford office several months after the incident and served in that position until his retirement. When Linman contacted Thornton in the mid-1990s, the engineer expressed his belief that the overall operation had been a success, despite the fact that it had been transformed into a public relations disaster by what he considered to be hostile media coverage. The Cioslaw Pioneer Museum now houses bone fragments from the Florence exploding whale, which local press has called Florence's most infamous moment. The story might have faded into obscurity had it not been for writer Dave Barry, who brought it to widespread public attention in his Miami Herald newspaper column of May 20th, 1990. After viewing the television footage, he wrote that they watched it often, especially at parties. Sometime later, the Oregon State Highway Division began receiving calls from the media after a shortened version of Barry's article was distributed on electronic bulletin boards under the title, "The Far Side Comes to Life in Oregon." We started getting calls from curious reporters across the country right after the electronic bulletin board story appeared, explained Ed Shopes, Public Affairs Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Transportation. They thought the whale had washed ashore recently and were hot on the trail of a governmental blubber flub-up. They were disappointed that the story had 25 years of dust on it. Shopes fielded calls from curious parties in Oregon, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Massachusetts. The Wall Street Journal called, and Washington, D.C.-based Governing Magazine covered the immortal legend of the beached whale in its June issue. The phone kept ringing, Shopes added. I get regular calls about this story. The phone has become the blubber hotline for ODOT. It amazes me that people are still calling about this story after nearly 25 years. The K2 footage eventually resurfaced as a video file on several websites, becoming one of the internet's earliest viral videos. A 2006 study found that the video had been viewed an astonishing 350 million times across various websites, making it one of the most watched videos on the early internet, decades before platforms like YouTube would revolutionize viral content. In 2020, residents of Florence voted to name a new recreational area, Exploding Whale Memorial Park, in honor of the incident. The park now features a memorial plaque commemorating the event. For the 50th anniversary in 2020, K2 pulled the original 16mm footage from their archives and released a remastered edition of the original news report in stunning 4K resolution. Today, Florence celebrates Exploding Whale Day annually at Exploding Whale Memorial Park. In 2024, the public was even invited to build an altar for the exploded whale, demonstrating how this bizarre event has become firmly embedded in local culture and history. The legend of the Oregon whale continues to captivate new audiences, proving that sometimes the most unexpected stories become the most unforgettable ones. The incident also prompted lasting changes in Oregon state policy. Currently, Oregon State Parks Department policy is to bury whale carcasses where they land. If the sand is not deep enough to allow for proper burial, the carcasses are relocated to another beach, a far cry from the explosive solution attempted in 1970. The story of the exploding whale serves as a powerful reminder that government, even with the best intentions, can sometimes produce results that far exceed expectations in the most unexpected ways.